go ahead and do that.
We're recording. All right. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Sarah Zabo, and I work in the Office of Alumni and Parent Engagement at Furman, and have the privilege of overseeing this new alumni learning community. We hope you've been enjoying this community so far. We really believe in the Alumni Office that learning is a lifelong endeavor, and hope that this new platform has created an environment that allows you to continue your journey in learning. We are really excited today to be hosting our first of hopefully many webinars led by our esteemed Furman faculty. We're thrilled to be joined by Dr. Brandon Inabinet, who is an associate professor in the Communication Studies Department at Furman, and an esteemed alumnus, Patrick Curley, who is a 2004 Furman graduate and is the Senior Vice President for Digital Advocacy at the DC firm Subject Matter. So thank you guys for being here today. I have no doubt that our participants are going to glean something from today's conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our men of the hour, Brandon and Patrick. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Okay, let me get the screen sharing going here. And just introduce myself a little bit more. I've been at Furman now for a decade as a professor in communication studies, and my training is in classical rhetoric, and so I'm fairly useless to the world except for deep theory and philosophy and so forth. But of course, the students have brought out a very practical side of me, which is, thinking about very contemporary concerns about risk and crisis management and communication, talking about advocacy and agitation, how do you get your voice heard in a democracy, and all kinds of things. So you'll see both sides of that today, that there's the side of me which is really interested in antiquity and questions of where do these ideas come from and how do we receive them today, but then also how do we apply them to the world that most of us experience day to day that doesn't involve talking with Aristotle or Hermagoras. And so you'll see both sides of my life in terms of the scholarship and the teaching come out today. And Patrick, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit more?
Sure. Well, as Sarah mentioned, I'm an '04 grad. I actually graduated with a degree in computer science, but quickly came up to DC and made a career in public affairs and advocacy. Worked on Capitol Hill for a few years, and then moved into the private sector, initially starting in a crisis communications firm, which leads to a lot of the conversations and theory you'll hear me talk about, and have spent the last 10 or so years a little bit more on the corporate and public affairs side, with helping lots of companies and organizations figure out the right way to get their point across, in particular on social and digital media.
And Patrick, I should mention, we've stayed in touch. One way is just, of course, as friends and kind of the social media sphere and all that. But then our department, I think it was about 3 years ago maybe, found out about this really cool guy who's doing amazing work with communication out there. And they kept talking about this person. We think he works at Bresson Marsteller and so forth and so on. And it didn't clue into who it was. And then finally it turned out it was Patrick, my old friend from class of 2004. So I was really happy to welcome Patrick back. And I think for those of you who were on the call earlier, it turns out that every time that Patrick comes down, I tend to be on a study away trip. So we've rarely overlapped in terms of him being our professional in residence in the department, me being there at the same time. But we're going to make it work eventually, so we get to hang out.
And my apologies again to all those slightly less prepared students that I spent a week trying to share my insights with, but it was a lot of fun and a great reminder of what Furman does best.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, let me get started then. Like I said, one of the things I wanted to kind of feature was how that liberal arts background can apply to the workplace. And so, that book on the left there that you're seeing, Aristotle's, hopefully you're seeing, let me know if not, but Aristotle's Rhetoric is a text that we teach in the Communication Studies department. It's one of the messiest books in history. We think a lot of different authors were writing and compiling their sources from Greek antiquity into this text that came together, by the time of Aristotle's death in 323 BCE. So we've got that text, and wanted to especially highlight his theory of topoi. And topoi is the Greek word for like places. So resting places for an argument. You know, if you're going to have a reasonable exchange with somebody, where are some of the hinge points that you might come to rest at? And so you can see his long list here of things that he thought in Greek antiquity were important. Some of them I think have become less so, but I wanted to focus especially on the question of course of action today. When responding to a crisis like COVID, what course of action is and where the argument's going to standard take their position at. You know, what are the likely policy points that are likely to be in debate? And so you'll see on this next slide here that we can distill those into what debaters just know and can rattle off with no problem. Ill, blame, cure, cost is the framework that we often use in debate that are the resting points of that argument about policy. You know, so if you're ever going to get into policy work, you have to know what's wrong, who's to blame for it, how to fix the problem, and then cost means cost benefit. So you, especially as a good orator, you don't want to just talk about the negatives. You want to paint the picture, often in visual terms of what the positive solution is going to look like. This is when you get really great, like presidential eloquence on a topic, right? When they tell you this is the America that we want to live in one day, and paint that picture of the positive. Patrick, I know you had some things about how PR firms are looking at this.
I was just going to say, right, organizationally, or when we work with organizations, we follow something kind of similar to this framework and trying to not necessarily figure out the argumentation, but personify some of these different aspects of it in a way that hopefully helps people better appreciate the circumstance and the solution that we're bringing for it. We often talk sort of in terms of victim, which obviously is aligned with the ill, and you know, sort of who is the person that is going to be affected most by whatever situation has come about. We have someone, generally we try to identify as the vanquisher. This is the leader or the person inside of a company or the company itself that is bringing forward a solution. And then validators, which are the people who are often third parties, issue experts, and individuals who can help us get into the nitty gritty of the cost and sort of the benefits and why the solution that's being provided is particularly compelling. That sort of framework in and of itself is a bit of PR on its own. We generally try to tell companies and clients that if they're going to be really successful here, the blame category is one that they might not want to be caught actually assigning, because leadership might be best done if they're not the people sort of pointing the finger to someone else. And so we often have that validator group, or even the vindicator, outlining a long-term solution that hints at where the initial problem was found, where that blame can be placed. But it's something that often kind of comes in a different spot in this, in the way we might communicate it publicly. But it's certainly key to, I think, helping people understand that it's serious and something we truly understand.
That's great. So one of the other figures I wanted to introduce right here at the beginning is Hermagoras of Tymnus. So Aristotle, 3rd century BCE Greek philosopher, you're all familiar with. Hermagoras is probably somebody you're less familiar with, but if you're a lawyer, you probably have maybe heard his name once before at least, because he is, we only know his work through fragments, but he's the lead thinker in terms of what are the traditional questions a lawyer has to ask in the courtroom. And so he gets picked up by Cicero, which is how we know most of his writing. And from then on, it becomes codified as Western law. And so when you're dealing with a court case, you can see some of the Latin down there about the who, what, when, where, why. That kind of framework comes from Hermagoras that we just sort of rattle off with no problem today down there. So you'll see here, when it gets to Cicero, he's kind of made this concise for us and made it clear that most legal cases come down to four stasis, and this is a very similar word to topoi, just like homeostasis. This means like the resting point, the neutral place between the arguments that are shifting. And so Cicero is looking for sort of what are the key places in a courtroom where you would have to argue about did the person, was there a crime committed? What is the label of that crime or the definition of that crime? How does it fulfill some sort of actionable offense? Was it bad or good? You know, so for example, was it done in self-defense? Can we identify with the, you know, to Patrick's terminology here, if there's a victim, can we identify with that victim and say it wasn't the greatest thing that happened for that company to, you know, act in that certain way, but we can certainly understand why they would have made that move, and so we can identify and therefore, you know, judge it, even if it is a crime or if it is something that shouldn't have happened. We can identify with it and say this is all right in our eyes because the quality wasn't that bad. And then lastly, the procedural or place stasis, which is the one about, is this the right court to hear this case? Or again, outside of the courtroom, it might be, you know, who is my audience? Who gets to decide what is right or wrong about this issue? And so as we talk about COVID today, we might talk about things like, you know, expertise. Does the CDC get to handle this part of this question? Does the White House get to set policy in this area, or the Congress, or, you know, in private companies? You know, is it our job to have to answer this for our customers, or should someone else be answering that? And Patrick, again, I know you got some things to say here about how stasis theory looks in the modern world.
Well, right. And I think that just like those are sort of resting spots or like set spots where we consider the issue and decide how to advance. When it comes to organizational communications and whether or not they're really effective, I think we have inflection points we're always looking for on our side to make sure that we're planning against them and that we're doing our best to make sure that they're as avoidable as possible. The first is always surprise. When you're in this sort of issue or crisis framework, you can be prepared, but most likely if something is coming up, it's going to be something that's a little bit unexpected, and in the worst case, truly a crisis or something that could have not been anticipated. Being prepared for that surprise can come in the form of actually already having some sense as to what you would communicate in that moment, but at the very least, it's going to be having a framework that you can assess it, similar to this one here. The longer you sort of sit in that surprise, though, that generally lends to insufficient communication. And the longer we let that go on, where we're not getting out there and expressing that we've seen that there is an issue, that we're working to assess it, that we have a solution, that generally means that we ramp up what people expect from us in the end. And so we want to be moving through these steps, as you can guess, pretty quickly so that people have less time to sort of offer their own solutions, sort of address these four stases on their own. And I probably just did the pluralization of that totally incorrectly, so Brandon can tell me. And then, you know, do all we can to avoid an expectation gap between what we have to offer and what people really expect from us. And again, a lot of that gap can really just be driven by the amount of time that goes on between when it's first discussed or first identified and when we actually can provide any meaningful step forward. The longer that goes on is when we move from, you know, something that is a modest inconvenience on social media with someone commenting to sort of a lingering issue to a full-blown crisis that requires more assertive action, you know, that we might not want to be, we probably would wish we didn't have to take and could have avoided had we worked through some of what we're going to talk about next as quickly as possible.
So one thing you're telling me is when I got that rush of emails that every company had their hands on COVID, they knew exactly how to respond and what safety mechanisms they had in place, and they were put their customers first and all that. I should have just expected that, huh?
I can't claim that they were all prepared, but I can tell you they're all watching what each other was doing. And so that's probably why a lot of them sounded the same as well.
Yeah, my inbox was full of those, you know, just sort of the same kind of thing about we're taking the utmost care and so forth and so on. At a certain point, I think they, you know, that burnout, I didn't want to see any more companies telling me how they put their customers first. I just wanted to get to my other emails that I actually had to respond to. So, well, let's look then at this kind of imposing chart that I'll put in front of your eyes for a second here. What I've done here is put the topoi across the top, Aristotle's ill blame cure cost policy framework, and then on the column on the left you'll see conjecture, definition, quality, and place. And that's the stasis. So lining these up as a chart like this is super helpful. I was introduced to this by my advisor in grad school. It's never really been published, which I think is a shame, because I think it's a really helpful framework. As you can hear from what we've already said today, it's not just for something like institutional response to a crisis. This can be used in courts, in policy, decision-making, on and on and on, as a really helpful framework. And so if you're taking notes, or if you want to jot down the ill, blame, cure, cause, conjecture, definition, quality, place, would be a great thing to use. And we'll talk about some of the uses for it in a bit. But you see what's going on here. So let me take you through, and we start in the top left and we work our way down. And I don't just mean that in terms of like how we're going to do it today, but typically in a good argument, that's also how you run the argument. And so if I'm talking to like my debaters, if I'm coaching them about how are you going to run the argument, how are you going to take us and arrange us from the beginning of the problem to the end, I ask them to go through these questions. And typically what you want to find is that your audience is with you, right? That they agree to the top left, and then you can move down, down that first column of ill, and then over to blame, and then down again, and then cure, down again, and then finally cost, and down again. And so you want to first, of course, get people to believe COVID is real, and if we're not there, then we can't have a rational discussion about it, right? If we say COVID's, a fake or a hoax, there's no real virus out there, it's not going to be a productive conversation. And so if I'm training my arguers to argue well, they have to establish this stuff. Now, one way to quickly do that, in a kind of policy or argument arena, is to pretend like all the cool kids already believe that thing. And so one thing that I teach my students to do is to even if there is somebody out there in the world that's challenging some of this basic factual information, basically say, for the sake of us moving forward as an organization, here's where we are. Or for us to be able to make good laws, we have to assume X, Y, and Z is true. Or even, like I said about the cool kids, I mean, if you even just paint the picture that most people out there in the world who are reasonable, intelligent people are of a certain viewpoint, then you can move forward. Now, should we sometimes go back to those questions because new evidence comes to light? Absolutely, right? So, can COVID be defined? We may find that the protein structure of it is different after some research or something. That's absolutely fine to go back to something. But what we see in the public sphere out there is that people will often ask questions about any number of these and therefore have a very unproductive conversation, right? And so what you see in terms of pundits, media, and so forth is that we probably ought to be asking questions like, how much will the cure cost? Once we get vaccines, for example, in the fall, let's say that happens, how are we going to allocate them? How are we going to spend money on them? But instead of that question being the one that's, on air, you might find something on social media today posted about, is COVID even real? And then, maybe somewhere else, the president says he has all authority to respond to this. And CDC is, so all these questions that should be relatively settled at a certain point get re-invoked. And again, that's not a problem when there's really good new evidence that you would want to go back and reconsider something that's already been sussed out, has already been discussed. But what problem, if I was to diagnose the current public sphere, our one of our big problems is that in terms of a reasonable debate, you can't keep going back to certain points that have been well established. Otherwise, you just confuse people. And this is, I think, why you get to the situation we have today, which is that people, and I think one of the things that has happened in COVID response is that there's been so much information. For example, the amount of press briefings on the White House lawn, I think people have lost the message, right? And so we've gotten back to questions that should have been settled, invocation of questions that were pretty clearly answered by somebody else. But because Trump is great for headlines, we're looking for him to bring up something else that might unwrinkle something that we've already kind of established and discussed in the past. And so, if I was in a position of power, I might ask that those briefings be culled significantly, that, once a week at most, otherwise have the CDC messaging directly to the public on public health protocols, but don't have the president having to get the barrage of questions over and over. And then, as you all know, social media has been another big factor here, right? So all of the posts that come out of social media that try to bring us back to an earlier point of, is it a hoax, or at least is it something that was actually a Chinese, based virus, and so forth and so on. And these things keep piling up. And part of it is just the sort of attention economy. If you can get people to look at it and click on it and so forth, that's good for things. But I think also leaving people in a state of confusion allows folks to rush in, right? So if we're more confused than we think we should be about COVID and what's going on in the world, then whoever it might be out there messaging to us can more easily reach us. And so just a real point of caution there about the amount, the oversaturation of our attention.
And I'd say that, I think that this is something that, regardless of this issue or any other, it's one of the hardest parts of any sort of communications response in these issues is knowing when to state something with certainty and when to leave the door open that you don't know the answer. Clearly, saying you don't know the answer too often kind of could undermine the effort itself. But if you make claims that you aren't 100% sure of, or at least 80% sure of, and you too often have to revert back on them, to Brandon's point, it's important that we have the opportunity to go back and reassess those questions, or if we find new information, bring it forward. But if the story becomes every day, there's sort of new answers to those same questions, then we've made mistakes early on that are going to really hurt our effort to communicate authoritatively for the duration of the issue. And again, that's not something specific to this issue or this administration. You see companies do it all the time, where they rush to provide a solution that isn't quite lined up because they didn't stay in that sort of ill column long enough to really understand what they were up against.
Excellent. Absolutely. So I think what most of you are on the call today probably about is not how to process news. I do occasionally talk about that with groups, especially in the local Greenville area. We talk about fake news and how to become more media literate and all that kind of thing. But specifically today, we wanted to talk about response. And, let's say you're in an organization. Some of our attendees were coming from Furman, some were coming from the CDC and other really valuable institutions out there that are having to create response messaging, and talking a little bit in depth about how you line that up. And so here we've used the same exact chart, but instead of doing what in the rhetoric world we call forensic rhetoric, which is past fact, like where did this virus come from and how did we, how do we fix the problem and so forth, which is all a question of this virus that we know, is a historical argument about and a factual argument about how was it handled. Now we're in the world of kind of the subjective and the future oriented, which is how do you meaningfully respond to something like the COVID pandemic. And so I've done that same chart that we just saw, ill, blame, cure, cause, conjecture, definition, quality, place. And now I filled it out from the position of an organization that's attempting to respond. And you'll see the questions look a little different, right? So instead of the question of, is COVID real? This starts with, has there been a lack of communicative leadership? Right, and so asking those hard questions. And then as you move on and as you move to the right, you see that the questions become about addressing the issues substantially. And so again, this is where Patrick has been working for the past decade, is, how does your organization respond in a crisis environment, and what constitutes a meaningful response? If we just go through briefly here, we can talk about how, first acknowledging that there is an information gap. There is a lack of meaning. I think one thing that you always have to remember with crisis is that what people need is a sense of meaning and purpose. Something's been robbed of them. There's trauma, and that has robbed them of a completeness, of an integrity that they had going into it. And you can imagine sort of a little hole missing on their body or something, right? It's like something has gone missing, and somebody has to rush into that vacuum and fill it. And it can be, the CDC and health experts, it could be policymakers, it could be corporations that are trying to sell something. They all have meaning to make out of that situation. It could even be family, members, of course, providing some meaning and healing in that moment. So where is that gulf? Where is that lack of information? How are they feeling that vacuum? And in terms of a company or something, you might even want to look at, where did we fail? What's been the lag time, to Patrick's point about insufficient communication? How long has it taken us to respond? Then we might move to things like, blame? Are there factors out there that explain whatever issue people are feeling? Obviously, the acknowledgement of COVID as this big crisis, but you also might want to find places in the world outside of your organization too that specifically have triggered problems for you. We're waiting on the legislature to tell us about what that relief bill is going to look like, or we're waiting for the CDC to tell us how many PPE, how much we should budget for masks or whatever else. And so to acknowledge there's blame, and I think sometimes blame, especially in the highest level of politics, can look really nasty because it's just finger pointing in every direction you can find. But I think most rational organizations need some version of this where they think, okay, what are the reasons that we couldn't release information before now, and to be meaningful in that response.
Where this happens most often, or like some of the worst of that scenario that you just outlined, Brandon, is actually in data breaches, because very often the responsible thing for a company to do is to not alert the customer and coordinate with law enforcement while they can try to track down who perpetrated a breach or a hack and actually try to take down that entire operation, as opposed to just replace a bunch of credit card numbers. And so very often, in my position, some of the hardest things to communicate is that sort of scenario where the company was actually taking every step. And in this case, it wasn't because law enforcement is doing something wrong or because the government, was stifling the issue. They're actually proceeding the way you'd want them to for a larger gain, or, the larger solution. But in the meantime, you've got consumers who feel that they've had their personal information exposed, or they've had to deal individually with, fraudulent charges on their credit card without the support that the company or, an insurance company could have provided had the issue been announced earlier. And so those are, that's the kind of scenario where I think we're always battling, doing the right for the greater good, and making sure that we're doing something that still ensures some consumer confidence, not only in the company itself, but in the future of this kind of reaction, that we're going to have future data breaches, we're going to have future pandemics. How do we work through this communications framework, or how do we make sure we're communicating the right things at the right time, while also making sure that we're doing the actual work needed to avoid the situation in the future, or at least get through the situation in the future in a more efficient and safer way.
That's great. Yeah, like you said, I think especially for those of us within the communication industry, those are important to have benchmarks and to have expectations. So you're not going to come out of a data breach situation just perfectly, right? I mean, there's no way in which you're going to come out of that situation and feel like, everyone's just so happy. We caught the bad guys, and no one had, once someone learns that their information is out there, they're going to feel violated in some way. And so knowing where that bar is for communication experts, because otherwise you're kind of doomed to feel depressed and like a failure all the time, because that you're not going to make everybody happy. But you have to get to that point where you say, at least if we can, and this is getting to the bottom right of this graph, at least we can say that we were successful in terms of our goals, which was not to scare people to the point that they left our company or filed legal suit. We were able to, again, give enough time to our law enforcement to catch the person in that case. And so forth. The same with COVID response, that, again, feeling like if there's this hole in your, body, it's not the case that any one individual or organization should have to fill that hole. And no matter what, you're going to come out of that situation feeling like we only were able to refill a piece of it. We were only able to give people a little bit of meaning in this time of crisis. But that was our goal, was just to let people know it's going to be okay in this part of your life. Rather than trying to fill that entire vacuum yourself. And again, feeling kind of like it's always an imperfect and partial job. We can even talk on a kind of existential level of communication that, that's an entirely human feeling, to feel like communication's never perfect, right? That there's always more that could be said. There's always a better way to say something. We always have that feeling. Even when we look back at the great orators, the great speakers of all time, they walk away from one of the situations. I think Lincoln's always a good example here. Walked away from Gettysburg and said, "Boy, that went terribly." Honestly, the press the next day was really terrible. It was like Lincoln got up and for like 2 seconds tried to address people and had very little words to deal with the situation. And then people started actually reading the text after a few days and said, oh my gosh, there's actually real wisdom here. And of course, it becomes the most popular speech of all time. Just an example of, if you're looking for daily fulfillment, this is not an industry to be in, because it's going to feel like you're losing constantly. And to set those benchmarks and goals for yourself that are accomplishable.
And I think, I hesitate to use the word, but I think in this moment, a lot of the companies who are, to your point, not trying to solve the whole situation themselves, actually find, and again, hesitate to use the word, opportunity in this moment, wherein they can find ways to highlight their particular issues, or how something that they've for a long time tried to draw attention to is particularly exacerbated by this moment. So, lots of minority populations, lots of underlying health conditions, lots of socioeconomic issues. These are all groups that, while they aren't, they want to be complementary to the here and now, but make sure that the conversations that are happening, or being able to have really fruitful and substantial conversations, that they're very prepared to have and contribute to the overall solution. We work with a lot of specific trade groups that represent frontline workers, the aviation industry, groups like this, where we've been able to jump in and certainly not try to take away the attention of the nation from finding a cure or making sure that each individual person is particularly safe, but finding times to say, this has been an underlying weakness in our system for a while. And while we're trying to address the short-term economic needs or make sure that there's enough ventilators, there are ways in which we can make sure that, in this moment, we're setting ourselves up for the future. And I think those are ways in which the people who might be, or might feel a little bit at the periphery in this moment, or feel like their issue is being sidelined by this greater focus, have had a lot of success. Because I think, to Brandon's point earlier, we've all gotten the "we're in this together" message. It's the people who are kind of taking it the next step and finding ways to be really substantive in how they're responding, or provide specific solutions, not just blame, or not just sort of more statistics. Those are the individuals who I think are gaining yardage here, again, from their communications perspective only.
Absolutely. Good. So what I'm going to do here is go through just a few pieces of advice that I've collected in terms of handling this. I'll attack it first from kind of a personal standpoint about just, you're not affiliated with an organization, you're just living your life. How are you going to respond to this communication atmosphere? And then again, follow up with sort of from the corporate level or the institutional level as well about once you're in a group that's responding, what are some of the important things to keep in mind? And then we'll open it up for Q&A. I've seen already 3 great questions in the Q&A, some that are about information we've already covered, and we're going to go back to it. So that's wonderful. Keep on putting stuff in that Q&A if you'd like. By the way, you won't see your question doesn't go public until we respond to it, and so just give that we will, but just give that a second for us to get there. All right. So first of all, I was going to say, of course, and this is different information than our field was giving 10 years ago. When I was in college 15 years ago, yikes, the information, the idea was vary your news sources, which is still good information. But I also think the more important thing now is limit your news sources. Limit them to, if it's television, I would say at most 30 minutes a day of televised news. Because again, what now after this talk is that you're being put back through that cycle over and over again on things that are pretty well established and probably aren't where your attention needs to be. And so it can drive you crazy. And so I would highlight that as one of the important things. Again, vary your news sources in terms of ideology or whatever else. That's important too. It's not that old information was bad information, but I just think putting a reasonable limit on how much you're seeing of anything, of any particular spin is really important these days. Otherwise, you'll get unhealthy with the news you're consuming. Especially, I picked this frame just because you've got the 3 commentators all arguing about something that's, again, usually something that's relatively well settled. Wouldn't matter what logo I put down there at the bottom. It could be MSNBC, it could be Fox News, it could be any other. Those are the most extreme, but pick your poison, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another is that I think one thing that we have to be thinking from a personal level is, how am I going to participate in a society in which we become more news literate and media literate? How are we going to spread communication information? I think it's super important that projects like these, the News Literacy Project, are taken into the K through 12 education, but then also even our adult education world, that we continue to push this, that people understand why corporations are messaging a certain way, why disinformation and fake news is utilized, and so forth. I think we have a lot of educating to do. And so if you can find organizations that you'd like to support, or even policies that help support that kind of education, are super crucial. I've seen a lot of people in reaction to COVID say, oh, if we only had scientists, which I think is great, and it's true. We could always use more doctors, more experts. But I think most of our problem right now is actually the kind of social science and humanistic problem, that people don't know how to process information in ways that make sense, or to understand the amount of information that's flowing to them in a reasonable way. Humans weren't built for this, and so we've got to educate people to be ready for that onslaught. Another is just, I have the whiteboard here just to signify that we can use that chart that I gave you for no matter what your level. And so if you're even on a personal level trying to figure out what am I thinking about COVID right now? What am I thinking? What's my family's response, or what's my household's response to this crisis? You can still use that same framework, right? Are people in my household at least on board with the idea that it's real, it's scary, we have to deal with it, et cetera, and work into that point where you're like, okay, what's our plan for today? Do we need to go, pick up more toilet paper or something? Is that what's going to make us feel like we've got this thing under control today? And so it's a useful tool even on a kind of personal level when you're not engaged in dispute. When you have to go out in the world and argue with people about what should our company, organization, or policy be, you're a little more well prepared and kind of figure out this is where we are at this point. So it can be kind of a self-help practice as well. And then on the level of organizations, a few more pieces of advice here. One is to, in advance of any crisis, and Patrick can definitely attest to this, have that what's called the procedural or place stasis settled. So you should not wait until the crisis comes to be thinking about things like who is our audience, where is blame going to be assigned in the organization, what parameters are there to our response, what media channels are we allowed to use, and so forth, or how will we judge the success of these things. That should all be the ongoing work every day of somebody. If you don't have a communication department in your organization, somebody in the organization ought to be handling these questions about what's the chain of command and who will be ready and waiting to answer these. I know Patrick can tell you about disasters probably too, where there wasn't one company spokesperson, there wasn't a unified approach, and so it breaks down. And so these should be handled well in advance, and to some extent, one size fits all. You should know that when this kind of crisis happens, these are the pathways of communication that will follow.
And it's really tactical, but this is why a lot of times if you're not in a communications function and you get invited to one of those, what feels like a waste of a day crisis tabletop exercises, it's because of this place row. This is really where all of those pre-written talking points and all of those, everything that we can prepare in theory, when we do that exercise, that's when we really see if the place is going to work out for us. Is that person the right person in front of a camera? Are they available? Who's their backup? What channels and how do we access them for social? How do we do all the things we say we will do is something that you have to test. You can't just sort of write down and hope it works out on the day of.
Another one is the questions that are on that conjecture and definition row. You might want to think about ways that you can get input in the midst of crisis from the entire organization or from public audiences so they feel they have a part. I think one thing that I've seen less of is, companies, like Patrick said, they immediately came out and said, we've got, we're supportive, we're here for you, this is going to be difficult and so forth. But I would love companies to also, even if it's not going to be the end decision point, but just to solicit ideas from their customers a little bit better and say, we've got a quick 3-question survey, it should take you less than a minute tell us how you're feeling. What would make you feel better about our response to this? And just create an inclusive atmosphere that these kinds of questions, especially questions of fact, like conjecture and definition, that those can be handled by everyday people. Fact, I'd like to see masks in my airplanes or whatever. These are things that we can objectively say and don't rely on a whole lot of guessing, and have people able to establish those facts for themselves is super important. Lastly, that when we get to the question of quality, these are the areas where a Likert scale survey makes a lot of sense to me. You're getting feedback on how did we respond, to what extent do you expect us to respond, and that kind of thing. And these are the more subjective areas where you could, again, give people that 1 through 10 scale and let them evaluate where they feel at any particular moment and kind of gauge the quality of response that they're getting. Again, these are normal practices within any organization, but applied to this framework that I've given you here can be super helpful. One last thing here. When you're in an organization, you can often, we do this for course design, we work backwards. So when I have a course that I'm preparing, I don't start with sort of like what's going to happen on day 1, day 2, day 3. I start with, when we get to the end of the semester, what will it feel like when we've accomplished what we wanted to accomplish? What will the class leave that classroom saying? Oh my gosh, I'm so glad I had this class because I now know X, Y, and Z. I can respond to this, that, and the other. I've got skills like this, that, and that, and then go back to the earlier questions based on that backward design. So that's one last piece of advice that I have, is to, if you're an organization, yes, this is where it's gonna, it's gonna go left to right and up to down, but backwards design. Say what does success look like in this case, and now let's start from square one based on that.
And I think it sounds probably a little sort of new age for a crisis, plan, but some of the most effective plans, and I think some of the most memorable responses, have come out of the sense that the company or the organization responding has a clear sense of like what its values are and what it wants the customer to really feel at the end, regardless of the remedial steps that had to be taken. Johnson & Johnson's credo is the one that always gets trotted out for this sort of thing, where they, make sure, and I can publicly say I've been part of several of these, recalls and crises with that company in particular, and it's true, they come back to that credo and they say, this is what we stand for. How are the actions we're taking going to get us back to this? It's not necessarily, the most tactical conversation you've ever had, but it's really illuminating, I think, and sort of gives you a North Star in making decisions about, a response being too costly or taking too much time or requiring a product to come off shelves, when you can go back to something that is what the customer, the consumer, the general public really expects of you beyond the moment.
Excellent. So we've got 15 minutes now for question and answer. And we've got a few questions in there already, but feel free, if you're listening in live, to put your questions in that Q&A box. We see them, and then when we answer them, which you'll see in a second here probably, they go live when we answer them. So let's see if that happened. Yep. Okay. We've got a few others here that I think Sarah's been responding to too. But let me, Peter's question here, Peter Sperry asked, are the points well established? And he's talking about that in that chart, as we go left to right and top to bottom. Are they well established because they're true, or because their acceptance signals loyalty within the Cool Kids Club? That's a really good question, and one that we get to talk about a lot in communication courses, because we talk a lot about, is the world subjective versus objective? Where is truth? All those good rhetorical questions that have no precise answer, but at least give you kind of a gauge. And one way that I usually respond to students on that is to talk about, in our field, we call it spheres and fields. So within different areas of the world, that question gets answered different ways. So for example, in the public domain, I think it's basically is the subjective answer. It's what do most people out there, what do most citizens think is true? And that's to some extent what truth is. Now, again, I'm not claiming here that that's a good thing or that we should just purely base our decision making on the majority of what people believe. But it is functional as truth in terms of things like politics and decision making, unfortunately. Patrick, do you have something?
I was just going to throw out, I mean, I think in the sort of the moment and how we respond, this is one of the areas in which social media, as much as it exacerbates problems, it helps well-prepared companies and organizations answer them as well. Because, with, a 1 hour lag between the data and a report on that data, you can get a pretty clear sense as to what your previous message or tactic did in terms of shaping that conversation and helping people come to terms with the answer of that question. And to Brandon's point, I think better assess where we need to make sure we're providing more information or we're doing enough compelling research on a topic to make sure that people are comfortable and confident in our answer in it. Unprepared social media is the worst thing that can happen to you in a crisis. But genuinely, I do believe, and it probably is because it's what I do, but if you know what you're doing and you've got all the right mechanisms in place, having that feedback loop from the general public can help break some of that tribal loyalty that you're talking about. Because done correctly, you're looking across, liberal, conservative, men, women, all these different populations, and being able to pull through the common threads as to what people think, believe, and what fact is, actually resonating.
Yeah, and then, but Peter, to make you feel better about this, outside of the public sphere, it's a lot more tethered to things like fact and truth. So obviously in like technical spheres of information where, whether it be like the CDC or health organizations or for us academics within our fields, you can't get away with much, and so we do have, when the sphere is created to handle something like, how do we know better about question X or Y, then the right conditions are created for a process that settles that in a way that's not that public, open, participatory process. So, for example, in academics, it's of course peer review. In an organization like the CDC, it might just be having to go up the chain of command. This question might have gotten asked at this lower level, but will it move up as something that is going to impact at all those levels and have an answer at all those levels? And those impose a structure. And my guess is, as Peter's question is asking, we could do more of that in the public realm. I think in a lot of ways, we need a lot of institutional reform that would help that. When you feel like, oh my gosh, the world is crazy and no one has an answer to stuff, that's probably a reason to ask questions like, well, could we generate a mechanism of feedback in the government that would work a lot better than this, or a lot of information systems that would work better than this? And the answer is absolutely yes. I think because we love the money that the chaos generates, we let it go. And I think there are ways that you could reform a lot of our communication, as Patrick said, even on the public level, that it wouldn't be so driven by tribal loyalties, but instead be driven by sort of a rule-based communications strategy. But they don't let us in the room most of the time because it's more fun and it's more engaging and you get more money from it being the Wild West, as we all know. So let's look at another question. Charlie here had one that Sarah made public, and for clarity's sake, can you just say COVID-19? There are currently 7 known coronavirus strains. Thank you so much. That's absolutely true. COVID-19 is the more technically apt name. I've gotten lazy in my own speech with that. I think still that both are trafficking to the point made before. If I was in CDC, maybe I'd have somebody disciplining me more often. But what's trafficking in public is still coronavirus and COVID in the current context, right? Outside the current moment, I certainly would want to. If I was writing this for an academic publication, I'd want to specify what I'm talking about a lot better. Good. Let's go to some other questions. Dennis has a question here. Go ahead and make that public. Dennis asked, and I know Dennis is in our Ali program. Hey, Dennis. A major issue we have in front of us is that different communicators regarding the virus have different goals and purposes than others who are communicating as an organization. Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is why we have that rowdy public sphere, right? Is because we want to have a place where all of that comes together to create some sort of inclusive common society, right? So that we can go down the street and say to our neighbor, like, man, can you believe how crazy this is? And all the different goals and all the different motives out there, you can still have a conversation at that public level about what ought to be done. But most of the time, we can kind of hold off and be more interested in those technical and private spheres about how's my company responding, how am I personally doing and responding to this, and again, some of those management tactics we talked about earlier. Because you don't always, one of the things that Cicero taught real well is you don't always have to be a publicly engaged citizen. That's important, and it should be from time to time what you feel like is your mission and calling in life. But if you do that every day, you'll get worn out, and you shouldn't feel like that's a duty imposed on you individually. Cicero was very vain and made it his, like everyday life was to be involved with politics and to be public. But he even said, it's an unhealthy way to live. You should think about strategies to limit your participation so that when you are performing, when you are trying to get your point across, you're doing it as well as possible, and basically save yourself for those times when it really matters. Peter's got another good question here, and I'll, it might be a follow-up to what we've already seen, but let's get it out there. So he's asking, how do you avoid causing resentment in groups that are, made out to be the enemy tribe, and accepting points to be true? I mean, basically, how do you negotiate the fact that we all very, very much have different places that we're at in terms of that chart? One of my friends might be at the question of, I don't even believe COVID exists still, and I'm down there trying to figure out, well, how am I going to get back for fall semester to teach? And how do I not make the person who's up there, the top corner, still dealing with is COVID even a real thing, not feel like I'm, being condescending, or that they should be resentful towards me for being further along in that chart? And I think it's a really tough question. It takes, again, a lot of that, what I just talked about saving yourself up and not dealing with this every day. I think everyone needs to take good, reasonable breaks from dealing with this kind of crisis response, because otherwise you're not your best, when it comes to those kinds of responses. And you need to think of strategies to get people on board to say, Patrick, fill in here, but when companies will suggest, we're feeling the same kinds of pressures you are, and maybe giving personal interest stories. I always think if there's a debate to be had, the best way to go about the debate is not to argue the policy, but it's just to explain your story, is to tell people, like, here's what I'm feeling. In my own family, for example, we had several people with COVID, and that usually changes people's tone. So if they want to kind of come at me and say, you don't know what you're talking about, COVID's not real or something, I say, well, the fact that we've been dealing with it in my family now for 3 months has really changed my perception on things. And that kind of political policy debate they wanted to have maybe is gone, and there's no more resentment. They say, wow, you actually had that in your family and they tested positive? Yeah, okay. So then we're on a different conversation, and maybe I've done a little work to change their mind without having engaged them politically, because I think they're going to usually react in a resentful way.
I mean, I think that the level of resentment in this scenario is somewhat unique, and difficult to sort of map to other issues and crises. But I do think that the realization that your public are all going to be at different places in their understanding of an issue, their appreciation for its severity, and what the right solution is something that comes up really often. And so when we work with organizations, we often are coming from at least two different sort of perspectives, a high and a low, but maybe others from there, wherein, we're communicating the sort of billboard version of the message. But for those who are, we have a recall of X product, here's what you need to do. It's a tweet length sort of message about what the right thing to do is. But for those concerned parents, or for the caretaker of the elderly patient who needs to know more information, we're communicating a whole raft of other information that gives them the information they need to really understand and assess what they believe. Because a lot of times that resentment or sort of that disconnect between two different audiences might just come from the fact that, you know, someone is living it and others are not. Some people have more information or more knowledge on the subject and others do not. And so trying to communicate to all those different groups in a way that will get out what is needed in the size and shape that is going to be effective is certainly one of those things that's, you know, to me, you know, kind of difficult, but given all of the channels of the modern sort of communications landscape, is somewhat easy to do in actual execution. It's the practice of how do you parse all that out and make sure you're making all those touch points that can definitely take some time. And I think, not to jump ahead, but I think to Katie's question, you know, like the length that you're seeing is in part, I think, due to speed and people not knowing what to do. It's the, if I had more time, I would have written you shorter kind of mentality that I think everyone feels the need to communicate everything on their minds all at once because there is so much swirl going on, as opposed to being able to agree on some facts and communicate exactly what their particular organization has to do with it or what they are doing with it. That makes this a really difficult moment for communications in particular.
Yeah, I wanted to bring it back to answer Kate's question. Kate Dabbs, hey, another Furman alumni employee and former student. You know, one of the things that we, of course, teach in college writing is to not use that funnel approach to communication. You know, every term paper I have to read, people's natural instinct is, from the beginning of time, many people have responded to things, and in this particular case, I'm trying to respond to, and you know, what they wanted to say was two or three paragraphs down. And I think companies feel the same pressure from a different way. You know, they like Patrick said, they want to embrace the entire, you know, thing, and so they start with these long-winded things about, you know, we understand the crisis that we're going through and the tough times we're facing, and on and on and on. And then, you know, maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs down, you get to the point, which was like, we've installed, you know, new HVAC in our airplanes. You know, it's something, and that was what we were getting at. And so good editors are always in demand, good college writing instructors who would cross through and say, you don't need all this. And in fact, like I said, one of the tricks of communication is to create the sensation that that's already been explained, you know, and to Patrick's point, you know, maybe somewhere on the website, there's that whole, like, we're trying to grapple with this and whatever else, just point to that. Just say, if you're interested in our larger COVID response, please click here. But today we wanted to announce we've got new HVAC in our airplanes, and just make it that succinct would be a great strategy to avoid those long-winded. I don't know why. I think, you know, just like everything else, when the world went crazy and you had your kids screaming in the same room that you're trying to type something, the good editing and that sort of thing went out the window, and the good process of revising this thing down to a succinct message really went out the window. And I think the easiest thing to do sometimes is to give a long-winded response, is to type everything and to make it feel as cushy as possible. And so I think that's a little bit of laziness on the side of our communicators out there. Well, that's about all the time we have, folks. I know that some of you probably have 1 o'clock appointments and all the rest, so didn't want to take any more of your time. We are always available. You know, my Furman email address is, of course, easy to find. So if you did have questions that didn't get answered today, if you have thoughts that occur and you'd like to follow up, feel free to do that. Patrick, I'm sure, is willing to be a little bit available too. He's a busy man, but yeah.
Absolutely.
We're happy to do that. And then the last thing was just to sign off and to let Sarah, if you want to come in again and just tell folks about Dens Day or anything else with Furman alumni. You know, I will say, from a professor's standpoint, higher ed is, of course, going through one of the most crisis situations we've faced, because especially at a place like Furman, being in person is the bread and butter of what we do. And having experiences, I was in Brussels when this all happened and had to quickly leave in mid-March. So we've really been impacted. And while we look luxurious at times, it's not so luxurious in terms of making the budgets meet. And so if you're able to just, and it may not be money, it may just be, you know, investment of in terms of communication, posting on the website and saying, hey, we're here for you. We're trying to support our alma mater and support Furman. That would all be great. Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon, and thank you, Patrick, for your time and for sharing all of the very insightful and very timely information that you did today, Brandon. I think a big takeaway for me personally was 30 minutes of televised news every day, I think could do a world of good for everyone. So thank you again for your time and for being such awesome members of the Furman family. Brandon referenced this, but yes, I would be remiss if I did not let everybody know that DINS Day will be Tuesday, June 16th. So please save the date. And if you have any questions, you can go to furman.edu/DINS Day. That's the DINS Day website. So please check it out. And just a couple of housekeeping notes. We are offering a lot of new opportunities to the ALC website frequently, so please be sure to check that website for some of the new opportunities. We do have a couple new things that have been posted recently, including a few mindfulness sessions. So again, I think that could be very timely in our current climate. And with that, I'll close. Once again, Brandon and Patrick, you guys are both incredible. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you everyone for attending today. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your days and stay safe and be well.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.